Story 1. What in the hell did we shoot? I never wanted to go camping, let alone hunting. That stuff's never been my idea of a good time. I'm more of a movie marathons and Thai food kind of guy. But my best friend Darren has always been into the outdoors. He grew up doing that kind of thing, and it's his way of unwinding. He'd been inviting me to join him for years, and I'd always declined. After a while, he stopped asking, until last October, when he texted me out of the blue, saying he'd rented a cabin upstate for the weekend. He wasn't giving me the option to say no this time, and he'd promised what he was calling a beginner's trip. I could tell how excited he was, so I said fine. Maybe it'd be fun. The first day was as miserable as I'd expected. The cabin was rustic, which is a kind way of saying the heat barely worked, and the bathroom situation was a freezing outhouse 20 yards away. Darren thought it was authentic. I thought it was cruel and unusual punishment, but I stuck it out. The second morning, he shook me awake before dawn, handing me a thermos of coffee so strong it tasted like burned wood. He had this look in his eyes, like he was about to tell me a big secret, and he started talking about how the best hunting was done at dawn. He handed me this rifle, a clunky old thing that looked like it belonged in a museum. "She's been in the family for ages," he said. "Lucky charm." We tramped through the woods for what felt like hours, Darren in the lead, moving silently like he'd done it 100 times before. He had the confidence and experience I'd expected, and I'll admit, it was reassuring. We eventually stopped near a clearing, where he showed me how to hold the rifle, steady it, and take aim. He wasn't laughing at me, which was a first. Instead, he was intense, calm, like he was imparting some kind of sacred knowledge. I respected him for it. The forest was eerily quiet. We hadn't seen a single animal all morning, and it was starting to feel like maybe we'd come out here for nothing. But then, just as I was about to give up, Darren grabbed my arm, squeezing hard, and pointed at a dark shape moving through the trees. It was far off, barely visible in the pre-dawn light, but it was something. My heart started pounding. Darren whispered that this was my chance. I adjusted the rifle like he'd shown me, aiming toward the shadow as best as I could. It looked big, definitely bigger than a deer, but I told myself maybe it was just perspective. As I zeroed in on it, Darren leaned in close and whispered, "Take it slow." I took a deep breath, steadied my hands, and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the trees, and the shadow crumpled. I'd hit it. Darren was grinning, practically beaming with pride. He slapped me on the back, and for the first time I felt like I'd earned his respect. We both moved forward, eager to check out my first real kill. But as we got closer, something felt wrong. The shape wasn't moving, but it didn't look like an animal either. It was too still, too solid. When we finally stepped into the clearing, we saw it lying on the forest floor, and all I could think was, what have I done? The thing lying in the dirt was humanoid, but only barely. It was hunched over, its arms twisted and claw-like, long with thick black nails. Its skin was grayish-blue, mottled and leathery, like it had been drained of blood long ago. The head was turned to one side, showing a face that was a grotesque mockery of a human's, with sunken eyes and a gaping mouth that seemed frozen in some kind of horrible scream. Its eyes, wide and staring, looked dead, like they'd been that way for centuries. I staggered backward, almost dropping the rifle. I heard Darren whisper something, but it didn't sound like his voice. He was staring too, his face pale and rigid, as if he'd seen something even worse than I had. He kept muttering something under his breath, something I couldn't understand. Then he turned to me, his face twisted in horror, and said, "We need to go. Now." I stammered, asking what we were looking at, if it was some kind of animal or something else. But Darren didn't answer. He was already walking backward, barely keeping his eyes on the thing lying on the ground. I followed him, my legs barely working, every instinct screaming at me to look away. But I couldn't. I kept glancing back, feeling its wide, empty eyes boring into me. We were so terrified, so completely shaken at the time, that taking any pictures never even crossed our minds. In that moment, all we wanted was to get as far away from that place as possible. We couldn't believe what we were looking at, and the fear clamped down on us so hard that we couldn't think about anything else except getting out of there. On our way back to the cabin, Darren finally spoke, though he wouldn't look at me. He told me not to speak of what we saw, not to tell anyone. He looked at me like I was a stranger, his eyes glazed over. Back at the cabin, he barely spoke a word, and he didn't sleep either. Neither of us did. In the morning, Darren packed his things, said something vague about cutting the trip short, and drove me back without so much as a goodbye. It was like he was trying to erase the whole thing from his mind, hoping that maybe, if he forgot it, it wouldn't be real. Months have passed, and I still see whatever the hell that thing was every night. I keep thinking about those dead, staring eyes, that twisted mouth frozen in horror. Sometimes, I'll wake up drenched in sweat. I don't know what that thing was, but it wasn't human. I haven't heard from Darren since that day. No texts, no calls. I've tried to reach out, but he doesn't answer. Part of me thinks he's doing the same thing I am, trying to forget. But the thing is, I can't. I keep expecting him to show up one day, knocking on my door, saying he needs to talk, that we need to figure out what the hell that thing was we shot in the woods. Every time I close my eyes, I see it lying there, mouth agape, those dead eyes staring straight into my soul. I wonder if Darren is haunted by it too, if he's as desperate as I am to make sense of it. Story 2. Forest Rituals. A few years back, I was a leader for a wilderness adventure group for teenagers. It was a small group in eastern Oregon, mostly run by volunteers like myself. I led one of the more advanced groups, teaching wilderness survival, hunting and fishing, first aid, and tracking skills. We'd go out a few times a year, camping for a week or so, learning how to navigate, cook over a fire, and handle themselves in the wild. I loved doing it, even though I didn't get paid. There was something special about guiding kids through these experiences. One year, we took a trip out to one of the larger state parks in the area, a place full of dense forests, winding trails, and some incredible mountain views. We had the whole week planned out, from setting up camp to scouting, and even practicing some basic hunting techniques. The kids were buzzing with excitement. Our campsite was set up near a river, not too far from the trailhead, but remote enough to give us privacy. By the second day, we had everything situated, and the kids were getting used to the routine. We still had a good few hours of daylight left, so I decided to take a couple of the older kids out for a tracking lesson. They'd been asking about it for weeks, and I figured this would be the perfect opportunity. There's something magical about teaching kids how to read the land, how to spot the smallest disturbances, and understand what might have passed through. We followed a narrow deer trail deeper into the woods, heading toward a spot I'd scoped out earlier. The path was faint, barely visible, with only the slight indentation of hoofprints and a few broken twigs giving it away. The kids were whispering, pointing out details I'd taught them to notice. A bit of scat here, a few snapped branches there. I was proud of how much they were absorbing. Eventually, we came to a small clearing with an old, battered lookout stand. It was a wooden tower, the kind hunters use during deer season, though it looked like it hadn't been used in years. The boards were weathered and splintered, and a faded sign nearby warned about the structure's age, advising people to use it at their own risk. It wasn't much, but it was sturdy enough for what I had in mind, a lesson on patience and silence. We climbed up, one by one. From the top, you could see far across the tree line. I gave the kids a few pointers about staying quiet, breathing slowly, and observing without disturbing the environment. I'd just handed one of the kids my binoculars when something caught my eye down below. About 100 yards out, near a cluster of pines, I noticed a faint movement. A figure, almost camouflaged in the shadows, was crouched down by the base of a tree, doing something on the ground. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It appeared to be a man, dressed in layers of dark green and brown, blending perfectly with the forest. At first I thought it might be a fellow hiker or hunter, but then I noticed what he was holding, a large hunting knife, glinting slightly in the fading light. I told the kids to stay quiet, motioning for them to keep low. We watched in silence as the man dug at the ground with the knife, pulling back clumps of moss and dirt. Then he pulled something out of his bag, a small bundle wrapped in burlap. I couldn't tell what it was, but he handled it carefully, almost ritualistically, as he placed it in the hole he'd made. For a second, I thought about calling out, but something in my gut told me not to. The whole thing felt off. The way he moved, how he looked around nervously, always checking over his shoulder. It wasn't normal behavior. I whispered to the kids to stay low and quiet, reminding them of the importance of staying hidden. Then, almost as if he sensed he was being watched, the man froze. He stood up slowly, turning his head in our direction. We were high up, partially hidden by branches, but there was no mistaking the sudden tension in the air. He stared directly at the lookout stand, squinting as if trying to make us out through the shadows. For a second, it felt like he was looking right at me. After what felt like an eternity, the man slowly crouched back down and covered the burlap bundle with dirt and moss, pressing it down firmly before standing up again. He then raised his hands over the freshly covered mound, his fingers trembling, mumbling words I couldn't make out. His whole body shook as if performing some dark, ritualistic chant. The sight was unsettling, an ominous act that sent a chill down my spine, making the air feel thick and heavy around us. After a few minutes, he snapped out of whatever he was doing. Then he turned and started walking in the opposite direction, quickly disappearing into the underbrush. When I was sure he was gone, I told the kids it was time to head back to camp. They didn't protest, sensing the shift in my tone. We climbed down from the lookout and made our way back in silence, my mind racing the entire time. I couldn't shake the image of that person, the bundle, or that eerie chant he had performed. Something about it all felt deeply wrong. When we got back, I pulled the head leader aside, explaining what we'd seen. His expression turned grim, and he immediately made the decision to pack up early. There was something unspoken between us, a shared understanding that whatever was happening out there wasn't something we wanted to involve the kids in. We packed up by dusk, the group moving quietly, almost instinctively aware that something wasn't right. By the time we made it back to the main trail, darkness was setting in, and the forest seemed to close in around us. It was one of the longest walks back to the cars I'd ever taken. Every sound in the woods set my nerves on edge. Later, after we'd returned, and the kids were safely with their families, I did a bit of digging. I looked up old stories, anything that might explain what I'd seen. I found scattered reports, stories passed down from locals about strange rituals and forest cults, rumored to use the deep woods for their gatherings. Most of it sounded like folklore, but there were a few stories that linked to a group known to have been active in the area decades ago, believed to practice ceremonies of protection, or something darker. I'll probably never know what was buried under that moss, or what kind of ritual we stumbled upon that day in the forest. But whatever it was undeniably strange. But at the end of the day, I'm just glad we managed to get the kids out safely, without anything dangerous happening. Story 3. Something Unnatural. I'm not much of a hunter. I've only gone out into the woods a couple of times as a kid, and honestly, I never found the appeal. But when my cousin Josh insisted I come out with him and his friend Roger on a week-long hunting trip in the dense woods of Montana, I figured, why not? I could use some fresh air and a break from work. So I packed my things, borrowed a rifle, and met up with them at a remote cabin at the edge of the forest. We planned to hunt deer and maybe elk if we got lucky. Josh and Roger were seasoned hunters. They teased me for being the rookie, but it was all in good fun. The cabin was small, rustic, and had the basic necessities. No electricity, just a few lanterns, and an old wood stove for heat. Perfect for getting close to nature, as Josh put it. The first morning, we set out around 4 a.m., under the light of a nearly full moon. The air was cold and sharp, the kind that bites through your clothes no matter how many layers you have on. We hiked deep into the woods, deeper than I was comfortable with, but Josh and Roger were confident, so I pushed down any unease I felt. Eventually we found a ridge with a decent view of a small clearing, and we set up there, crouching behind thick brush and trees for cover. Around an hour in, We heard something moving through the trees on the other side of the clearing. It was slow at first, a heavy, deliberate crunching of leaves and snapping of branches. Josh and Roger tensed up, and I raised my rifle, squinting through the scope. We couldn't see it yet, but from the sound it was big. We thought it might be an elk, maybe even a bear. After a few minutes I spotted movement between the trees. A large, dark shape, maybe 50 yards away. But it wasn't just the size that caught my attention. The way it moved, that was off. It was almost stalking, like it was hunting, carefully placing each foot, almost as if trying to avoid making too much noise. When it got closer, I got a better look. It was a buck, but its antlers were twisted and broken, one of them hanging by what looked like raw, bloody tissue. I remember feeling a shiver go down my spine. It was almost as if the thing had been in some fight, barely surviving, but still on the move. Josh whispered for me to take the shot, his voice low and urgent. I raised my rifle, aimed at the buck, and took a deep breath. The moment I squeezed the trigger, the buck's head snapped up, looking directly at me, eyes wide and dark, and for a second I froze. It felt like it knew I was there, like it was staring right into me, almost challenging me. I pulled the trigger anyway, and the gunshot echoed through the forest. The buck didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. For a minute it just stood there like nothing had happened. It was so odd. But then, in an instant, it bolted, tearing through the trees, still watching me over its shoulder with those unblinking eyes. Josh and Roger stared, dumbfounded. "I think you hit it," Roger muttered, his face pale and confused. We knew we had to track it down, so we left our cover and made our way over to where it had been standing. Sure enough, there was a blood trail, so we began to follow it. The trail led us through thick forest, down a ravine, and up the other side, far from where we started. We moved quickly but quietly, trying not to lose it. As we hiked, though, I began to feel strange. Every so often I would look around, swearing I'd seen movement out of the corner of my eye, slipping between the trees. I chalked it up to nerves or excitement, but that didn't make it any easier. Finally we came to a small, shadowed glade. The air was thick and heavy, almost suffocating. And there, lying in the center, was the buck. It was sprawled on the ground, neck twisted at an unnatural angle, limbs splayed as if it had been dropped from above. And yet, there wasn't a single drop of blood around it, even though it should have been bleeding out from my shot. We approached cautiously, weapons at the ready. Josh was the first to nudge it with the barrel of his gun, and that's when we realized the thing wasn't dead. Its eyes flickered, glazed over but watching, following each of us in turn. The feeling of being watched, of being studied, was so strong it made my skin crawl. Josh looked at me and whispered, "Something's not right." But then, we heard it, odd noises coming from all around us. We turned, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Yet the noises only grew louder. Heavy grunts mingled with what sounded like cackling, echoing unnaturally through the forest. It was so out of place, unsettling in a way I can't fully describe. For a moment, a chilling realization hit us. We weren't the hunters anymore. We were the hunted. Roger raised his rifle, aiming at the forest around us, but Josh grabbed his arm. "Don't," he whispered. Something's wrong." We backed away slowly, keeping our eyes on the forest around us. But as we did, the buck, still lying on the ground, started to move, its limbs twitching and twisting, pulling itself up in a series of grotesque jerks. It shouldn't have been able to stand with the way its neck was twisted, but somehow it did. And as it rose, its eyes fixed on us with a kind of look I can't describe, something more than animal. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my heart pounding as the buck took a step toward us. Then another. Josh grabbed my arm, his voice low and urgent. "Run," he said with an undertone of panic. We turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noises. Behind us I could hear the sound of the grunts and cackling intensifying even more. We sprinted down the trail, not stopping until we burst out of the forest and reached the cabin, slamming the door shut behind us. We were a mess, and decided that we should leave the woods immediately, while we could. I'll never be able to make sense of what we saw and heard that day. The sounds, that buck, it all defies explanation. The only thing I do know for certain, however, is that I'll never set foot in those woods ever again.